On a workbench in Paris, late in the winter of 1814, a clockmaker's apprentice sorts brass gears from 4 broken clocks into one shallow tray. The clocks came from 4 different makers, built in 4 different reigns, and none of their parts were cut to fit the others. Yet the puzzle in front of the boy is not the puzzle worth solving tonight. The real question is not how gears mesh, but how one man made 4 hostile regimes run on him. How does one mechanism run on parts that were never meant to mesh? Teeth from one wheel biting a wheel that was ground to reject them.
A city away, a man was doing exactly that, and not with brass. He served the monarchy, then the revolution that beheaded it, then the empire that buried the revolution, then the restored kingdom that swept the empire away. 4 governments that despised each other, and each in turn handed him the same office. Foreign minister 4 times over. The one seat where a state keeps its secrets. That is the movement to take apart, not the man's charm and not yet his name, the mechanism. How the same hands kept 4 hostile regimes running, skimmed motion off that machine, and stayed trusted enough to be handed the keys again. Somewhere the escapement is stealing motion. We are going to find where. Start where the escapement first stole motion, not in a treaty room, but in a church that had made the man and would soon regret it. He had once been a bishop of that church. In 1789, with the new assembly hunting for money the crown no longer had, he rose before the National Constituent Assembly in Paris and named the answer out loud. Let the nation seize the lands of the church, all of them, and pledge them against the debt. The clergy owned perhaps 1/10 of the soil of France, farms, rents, tithes stacked up across centuries. A bishop of that church rose and offered it to the men dismantling his order. Within the year, the assembly voted the lands nationalized, and the wealth that had ordained him became paper the revolution could spend. He was already profiting from the wreck before the vote had even closed. He was already profiting from the wreck, trading the institution that made him for a seat in the one that replaced it. The bishop helped strip the church of its own lands to survive the revolution. That is the first layer of the scheme, cold and stamped. He came before the church that made him, and he would come before every regime that followed. Self-interest explained why he moved. Dispatches from the front explained how he timed the exit to the hour. The second gear is timing, changing sides at the moment the old side became a liability, not a moment before. Set 2 moves side by side. In 1793, the king he served lay dead on the scaffold, but the man had already sailed for exile before the blade came down. Now lay the second against it. By 1814, those same hands were helping the Allied powers pull down the very emperor who had made him a prince. He read Allied troops massing near Paris in 1814 and left before the throne fell. The same hands, closing on the same hour. The first gear was greed. The second is a clock that never runs fast or slow, striking only when the old master is already falling. A man who leaves on time is not yet a traitor. He might only be a survivor. In 1815, he would time it a 3rd time, signing a secret pact against his own allies. Follow the 3rd gear into the one room where the whole machine shows its face. At Vienna, autumn 1814, 4 victors, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, meant to draw the map alone and hand France the result. France had lost. France was meant to sign whatever the 4 wrote. He forced the door with words, not an army. To the assembled ministers, he argued that only hereditary monarchs held rightful title to their thrones, turning France from beaten aggressor into a legitimate party. If thrones passed by blood, not conquest, the beaten king stood on the same ground as every victor, and a settlement made without him was made without law. Then he worked the seam they could not hide. Russia and Prussia wanting Poland and Saxony, Britain and Austria afraid of it, selling each side the reading it needed in exchange for a seat.
That is the third gear, not greed, not timing, but barter, legal argument, and private knowledge exchanged for a voice. France came as the beaten side and left with a formal voice in nearly every decision. A defeated nation had just talked its way onto the map it was meant only to sign. Every alliance has a seam. Talleyrand's whole method was finding it before the Allies did. The rift ran straight down the middle of the winning side. Prussia wanted all of Saxony, Russia most of Poland, and the Allies briefly drew up plans for a new war, not against France, but among themselves. A man with nothing left to sell still owns the space between two who distrust each other. He did not close the rift, he widened it and stood in it. To one pair, the wall against Russia, to the other, the reasonable voice at the table. In January of 1815, France signed a secret defensive pact with Britain and Austria, aimed at Russia and Prussia. Roughly a third of the coalition quietly turned its guns on the other two. The beaten nation now held one leg of a three-legged alliance against its own conquerors. But a secret pact stays secret only until someone needs it read aloud. The great powers absorbed the split and settled their own quarrel over Poland and Saxony. But somebody still paid for the crack he had widened, and the bill fell on the small houses who had no seat to defend. Now count who never got a seat at that table at all. Look at who actually came to Vienna, hats in hand, believing the words spoken there were owed to them. Roughly 200 states, free cities, and princely houses sent men to Vienna, most with no real leverage at all. They waited in the antechambers with their petitions while the map was drawn elsewhere. Here is the clue those clerks and minor envoys never got to read aloud. In place of the old Holy Roman Empire, the Congress drew up a loose league of an estimated 30-odd German states, folding hundreds of houses into a settlement none of them had written. Whole houses that trusted the process to speak for them were reorganized, absorbed, or set aside, and the paper that did it carried the same voice that had promised each side the reading it wanted. Small houses that had ruled their towns for centuries woke up as lines on someone else's map, erased without a shot fired. No army beat the men who trusted his word. Their petitions went into the fire unread, and no one at the table ever learned a single name on them. Not one of those erased houses ever knew whose hand had drawn the line through them. The last regime is waiting in the workshop, where the same hand that struck for 4 masters closes the account. This is the last gear, the one the whole mechanism was cut to reach. The man who kept those 4 regimes on the same movement, the one whose office we counted in the very first hour, has a name: Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Then reality walked in, uninvited. Napoleon slipped his exile with 1,000 men, and the quarreling delegates settled in days what no argument had settled in months. Every gear meshed at once, a balance among 5 great powers, no single winner able to dictate, each needing a broker, and the broker was the beaten nation's man. They signed 9 days before Waterloo and redrew borders that held, in broad outline, for close to a century. France walked out seated among the powers who had beaten it. But the price never moved. The clock that struck for 4 regimes never struck for the man who served it. Talleyrand died wealthy, titled, and distrusted by every side he had worn. Strip the charm and titles away, and one cold entry stays in the ledger. He simply outlasted the certainty they thought they had. He kept every regime armed with the same fear of losing him. So here's what the clock cost the man who built it. Each of those 4 gears you have already turned, greed, timing, barter, and the wedge, ran on the same movement, and every regime paid him in coin and titles, yet not one of them ever paid him in trust. It ran roughly 9 months, long enough that the Prince de Ligne joked the Congress danced rather than worked, and long enough to re-time a continent's clock by hand. And those hands kept moving after he was gone. Talleyrand died old and rich in a country that used his settlement for the better part of a century and never once left him alone in a room it did not watch. No one owed him loyalty, and in the end, he owed no one either. A machine built so that no one is owed loyalty ends by owing its maker none. The gears struck for 4 masters and for none. The small delegate in the crowded hall was never in the arithmetic, and neither, in the end, was the man who did the arithmetic. He bought a piece that held. He could not buy a single side that believed him. So the question is yours to keep. Weigh the near century of quiet against the small houses erased in that hall. Was Vienna a swindle or the price of a peace that held? Hold that verdict, because the next great peace made the very same promise, and it broke apart inside a single generation. That broken peace is the next blueprint we read. This is the Tactical Historian.